Thank you so much, everybody, for coming along to this event this evening to hear about forensic architecture. My name's Darren Kerr. I'm the head of the School of Art, Film and Media, and eternally grateful to Nick and the events team and Lydia for putting this evening together, and our guest who we'll introduce shortly. And thank you so much for asking me to come along to say a few words at the beginning. Delighted to be supporting Nick in an event such as this, and so great to see such a good turnout. I'm loving the cheap seats. They're fantastic. Good on you, and thank all of you for coming along too. I say that especially in the context of the research that goes on at the university, and especially across my own school and all the colleagues that work incredibly hard to battle for that time to actually do research and get on with that across art, film and media, especially because some of the central principles that underpin what they do crosses over really nicely with what we're going to hear about this evening as well. And that includes really incredible, fantastic, world-leading, creative approaches to real-world issues, socially minded citizenship with impact that kind of leads the way, and also helping to shape kind of current and future generations of creative and critical thinkers. Tonight we welcome Júlia. Hello, Júlia. Who Nick will say more about, and Júlia obviously will have the opportunity to introduce herself from Forensic Architecture for this talk about post-digital testimony. Just in a nutshell, if you haven't heard of forensic architecture, you really should. I confess I hadn't. And blimey, Charlie, what incredible work they actually do. Basically, an investigative research agency out of Goldsmiths, broadly dealing with the kind of politics of space. They are award-winning, they are globally recognized, globally impactful, and truly collaborative across disciplines, which you'll hear more about in just a moment. So not only are they aiming for some kind of political change and impact, and that happens across courts, parliamentary investigations and committees and so on, but they also exhibit their outputs around the world too. And I think that point is particularly important, that kind of global reach, especially at a time when we see just the very idea of complexity being reduced to overly simplified social divisions, simplified political binaries, post-truth sound bites trying to shape the way we understand our culture and society, where we've now got fact checkers that have to have a job keeping an eye on social media commentaries and posts, and also election leadership debates as well. Fundamentally, forensic architecture are just about new ways of understanding, new ways of seeing. And I think that brings us back to the kind of research that we do across the school and the university, which our colleagues are so good at. So I'm going to wrap up there and hand over to Nick for a few more words. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nick Rawlings. I'm the creative producer at the studio. We're a community of 100 residents who are creative micro-businesses, and we support them through funded residencies with access to space, development support, and tech training. We're part of Bath Spa University's Centre for the Cultural and Creative Industries, and we're a space for playful and experimental innovation with creative technology and social impact at its heart. But we're also a place for asking critical questions about our engagement with technology. And so I'm really delighted that we're joined by Júlia Nueno Guitart from Forensic Architecture this evening. It's been a long day. Over the last 14 years, Forensic Architecture have created a transdisciplinary practice across architecture, investigative journalism, video arts, 3D modeling, acoustic analysis, image and data analysis, and software development that has changed the way we consider conflict, power, state violence, and also how technology can both expose and obscure abuses. Their work contributes to investigative journalism globally, legal and reparation campaigns, including most recently to the Grenfell inquiry, Al Jazeera's reporting, and South Africa's case at the ICJ relating to Israel's war in Gaza. And importantly, they create exhibitions with their work and have shown at HKW Berlin, Documenta 14, the Whitney, the ICA, and in 2018, they were nominees for the Turner Prize. I'm delighted that we're welcoming Julia this evening, and she's been working on forensic architectures, investigations, and web platforms around the conflict in Gaza. Julia's talk will touch on difficult subjects, so do be forewarned. There are spaces that you can break out to if you need, including the cafe area over there. If you do need to go outside, please use the front entrance, not the side. We are filming this event, so there will be a Q&A at the end of the talk. If you'd like to ask a question, but would like not to be filmed, please let us know. I'll ask while we're doing that. And after Julia's talk, there'll be continued screenings of 3 works by Forensic Architecture. Over here, we have No Traces of Life, Israel's Ecocide in Gaza. That's about 8 minutes long. In the corridor just here, we have a film called Shireen Abu Akleh, The Extrajudicial Killing of a Journalist. And in the bleachers, which is the large theatre space through that corridor, we have German colonial genocide in Namibia, in Shark Island. So with that, thanks very much. Thank you for coming. And I'll hand over to Julia.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you to the studio for the invitation to Forensic Architecture to explain the work that we do, and especially also to the Bath University for taking us in today. My name is Júlia Nueno Guitart. I'm a PhD fellow at Forensic Architecture. My PhD research is on the way that spatial evidence can be used to understand AI systems and computational systems used by security forces. And at the same time, I'm a software developer, a computational designer, so that's how I will be centering the talk today. It would be on the tools and methodologies that we have developed specifically in this last year, since October 7 in the ongoing war in Gaza. And I will explain a bit what are those methodologies and tools. Some are already techniques that we have been developing for many years, and some of them are techniques that we have innovated with, given the magnitude of the crisis in Palestine right now. I'm going to give a short introduction of the work of forensic architecture, even though it has been given, but also maybe in my own view and my own words, and how we situate the current investigations and research we're doing in a longer work, specifically and situated in Palestine. So, as Nick was mentioning, forensic architecture is a multidisciplinary research group, which is based at the University of Goldsmiths in London. And we investigate the violence committed by states, corporations, and reactionary forces. We use spatial analysis and digital modeling to reconstruct incidents of violence and to build evidence that can be put forward then in tribunals and truth commissions, but also for communities that are seeking justice. So counter-forensic investigations begin at a moment of violence, but they don't stop at it. We seek to situate an incident within its larger history, trace repeated patterns of violence in time and space, and kind of probe the threat of history and long-term politics that allow us to connect a situated violence with its reverberations in other contexts, in other realities. I'd like to mention briefly some of the other research that we've carried in the previous years, situated specifically within Palestine. So we documented the ethnic cleansing in the 1948 Nakba, where 500,000 people were displaced from their homes. And we've also investigated extrajudicial killings of journalists like Shireen Abu Akleh, where you have the film that you can see after the presentation, or Ahmad Ekerat, who is a human rights activist. The more than 2,000 people that were killed in the 2014 military offensive in Gaza, the eviction and forced displacement of families in Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, environmental violence suffered within Gaza on the agricultural fields with the use of herbicides. You have the film there, No Traces of Life, which is reconstructing the current destruction of greenhouses and agricultural fields, but is built on previous research on the destruction of the environment in Gaza, as well as epistemic violence on cultural heritage and kind of the erasure of history for Palestinians. So these are a long history of occupation of a territory and a continuous dehumanization, intimidation, and violence towards Palestinians. The magnitude of the current war and the events right now prompted us to form working groups that could make sense of the mechanisms used to sustain the military campaign across different scales. And we have focused in 3 different areas, which allow us to also understand the different temporalities at which a war is operating. These are not teams that existed as such before last year, but they kind of emerged organically, given the needs that we were identifying as the events were unfolding. And I think it's relevant to say that there's up to 25 researchers at Forensic Architecture in our office in London, and some, like most of us, have been working at certain level in this last year to understand the events unfolding in Gaza. And that has also meant that some people have put aside other research they had ongoing, but we also do have an infrastructure that allows us to do that, meaning that we have an infrastructure that could allow to say, okay, we put this research aside, we center on the current events. So I think both of these things are important to acknowledge. A collective effort, but also an infrastructural condition that allows us to create these 3 groups. So as you see here, the first group is centered in uncovering manipulation and misinformation. The second one is looking at the expansion of the medium of warfare and the environmental transformation that warfare entails. And the last one is centered on pattern analysis. So yes, I will not name the 25 of my colleagues that have been involved in this, but I do want to highlight that this is a collective effort. At some point, I might highlight some of the names when it's specific to one of the investigations. Yes, so the first group has worked mainly on the media dimension of war. So dismantling instances of misinformation and manipulation. So a key element of this analysis, and there's too many investigations that that we have been working in the sense of uncovering manipulation and disinformation. One is the bombing of the Al-Ahi hospital, which happened on 17th of October last year, and I will get into detail into this investigation. And the second one was our response to the evidence submitted to the International Court of Justice by the Israeli legal team, where we analyzed the evidence submitted, and we found 8 instances where the materials submitted had incorrect annotations or misleading descriptions. So this can be understood as a rapid response team. We are working at the fast pace of news cycles and media battles, and this is kind of a challenge for forensic architecture, since we tend to work on longer-term investigations, and we are not a news agency, we are a research agency, but given the level of dispute on media around the events on the first few months of the war in Gaza, we found ourselves having to respond to this temporality. Both investigations that I'm mentioning are driven by counter-forensic methodologies. So the counter-forensic methodology understands that the production of evidence is kind of monopolized by states, and we are seeking the ways in which organizations and individuals can take those means of production of evidence and turn a bit, again, the state's means into the violence, of the violence it commits. Also, civil society groups that can use scientific and aesthetic means to produce this evidence and seek for public accountability. So some of the techniques that are in the core of the counter-forensic project is the synchronization of media in space and time, and some of the techniques are photomatching and triangulation, and I will get to them now. I think here, yeah, photomatching. So this is a 3D model of the Shifa hospital, which is in Gaza. And photomatching is when we create a digital model of a space, and then using images and videos that have been captured in that space, we locate them where we can basically point where the camera was where the camera was situated to take that image. And we situated both in space and in time. And this in itself becomes a form of verification of evidence. It allows you to, in a way, fact-check whether this media is manipulated or this media is a piece of evidence that has been taken by a witness of certain violence. And then triangulation is similar to photomatching, but in that case, what we use is we synchronize image and video using anchor points in footage. So, for example, I'm going to take the example of the Alahi hospital that I was mentioning earlier. So, just after there was this rocket explosion at the Alahi hospital on 17th of October, where more than, local authorities reported that 470 people had been killed. US intelligence agencies reported that between 100 and 300 casualties happened during that night. In the hours following the blast, there was the doctors that were present when the blast happened said that they were operating, and there was this loud explosion, and the ceiling where they were operating fell off. And it was the first big massacre of this war, so within Gaza. So the Israeli Defense Forces, Colonel Peter Lerner claimed that the Al Jazeera footage captured was a failed rocket that exploded in Alahi. And I think something that is interesting in this image, and that's why I've decided to add it to the presentation, is on the way that one produces evidence, right? I'm talking about this way of verifying, of situating evidence within a 3D model, about bringing a bit the history into the present of how that event has happened. But here we have like an image of a video, so a capture of a frame of a video that is printed into a sheet, and then there is a circle around the evidence or the piece of information that wants to be conveyed to an audience, and then there's a finger pointing to it, right? So this is a way of constructing an image, which I think is kind of probably at the antipodes of how we are building and constructing images ourselves. And I think is relevant in that sense because, for example, when we're talking about the work we're doing of triangulation, what we're looking, is at different videos that were taken that night. And we're taking the city lights as anchor points, trying to trace the trajectories of the 17 rockets that appear in that video to understand that one of the claims that the Israeli army made in that time was that the rocket that exploded was a failed rocket that had propellant still in it. But our analysis of the trajectories shows that it's impossible that any of these rockets had still fuel propellant within them for their trajectories. In this case, we cannot make a claim of whose explosion it was, but what we are working is with a form of negative evidence. So we are basically analyzing the claims put forward by the Israeli army, and we are working to dismantle those claims. And that is a form of creating evidence, through the negative, right? Through taking those claims that are made and are taken for granted and building from them and analyzing such claims. So the second group that I want to talk about is the one that's been looking at the expansion of the medium of warfare and the effects on the environment, from the ongoing war. So we have to understand that the violence that is suffered within Gaza and for the Palestinians within Gaza is not only like a physical violence, but is also the destruction of aquifers, of agricultural land, of archaeological sites. It's irreversibly transforming the environment, so it's like an erasure of the past, it's an interruption of the present, and it's a dominance of the future and the possibilities this future has. So what we identify in the expansion of medium of warfare is what Rob Nixon calls slow violence. So it's a violence against the environment that may be slow, indirect, diffuse, but is immersed in colonial and military violence. And since October 2023, we have investigated the systematic attack of orchards and greenhouses, and our analysis is showing that there's a destruction of the aquifers, and as I was saying, of the cultural heritage. And it has worsened the food crisis and the starvation in the region. So there's a wider pattern of depriving Palestinians of resources essential to their survival. So this group is working on the long-term effects of the war, right? So it's a very different approach than the first group I was talking, that is working at the fast pace of the news media cycles. This group is rather working for a future that is very uncertain when you're destroying the conditions that allow to sustain the present. So some of the techniques that we use in this case to look at these long terms are remote sensing, so satellite analysis images. So we have access to satellite imagery, and then we can compare the evolution of space through time. So for example, here we can see in the beginning and end of October what was the condition of greenhouses and what happens later down the line with those greenhouses and the repeated destruction of greenhouses and local food production. And then we've also been using NVDI analysis, which is normalized differentiation vegetation index. So basically it's a form of satellite analysis where you are looking at what light is vegetation emitting. So you analyze that radar response of the light that the vegetation emits, and what we were comparing is through the same months throughout time, what is the vegetation in Gaza, and we can see that from June 2021 to June 2024, there has been like a complete raising of all of the vegetation and fields. And finally, the last group, and this one I will extend a bit more to explain also some of the platforms that we have been developing and some of the analysis, big data analysis that we have been doing, is centered on investigating patterns of violence. So what means is repeatedly imposing harmful conditions on a group with the aim of physically destroying them, either entirely or in part. And this can include actions like denying basic needs, creating dangerous environments, or preventing access to essential resources. So yes, about this group, so this group's work has actually been a work of retroactively analyzing the large amounts of information that was coming out of Gaza. So this group kind of moves forward and backwards in time and tries to then compose and understand what's happening throughout this last year. So we have published research on patterns on the destruction of medical infrastructure, on the repeated displacement of population into areas that were then made uninhabitable, and then the repeated attacks on aid distribution and on workers distributing aid, which is also aimed in a way to dismantle the little sovereignty that is left within the population. So what our research team has been centered over these last few months is on producing also an evidence that can shift the narrative that was initially like accepted about what was happening within Gaza. And so we are producing this evidence both as a way to support the claims that have, to like create this negative evidence to some of the claims that have been made, and then also to support some of the legal work that is being done currently. Yes, so yes, as I mentioned earlier, there's around 25 researchers that we have worked on this. I would like to acknowledge though Peter Pollack and Noura Bouzaid, who are my colleagues at the computation unit, and with whom we've been working a lot with these techniques of data scraping and cartographic analysis and adversarial design, which is how do we design in a way that can question and contest some of the existing cartographies and designs that already exist to communicate a war and communicate conflict. Yes. So hospitals are an essential infrastructure for supporting the lives of any population, and since the very first weeks of the war, 1 million, on 13th of October, 1.1 million people were told to evacuate north of Gaza and move into the south of the strip. And as people were told to leave their homes, people also found shelter in hospitals. So we know that Shifa Hospital, Indonesia Hospital, received each over 50,000 people in the first weeks. So hospitals became like a central piece of the news very early on. So what we were trying to understand here was what was happening. We were having like different reports and different news coming from different hospitals. So initially, we mapped where these hospitals were, and then we scraped Telegram channels of local news agencies. So agencies that were reporting from the ground: Al Jazeera, Al Arabi News Television, Shehab Telegram, the Ministry of Health, any existing like media sources that were reporting on the ground. And I think this was between October and December. We scraped over 120,000 messages on what was happening on the ground. But we wanted to focus solely on any messages that mentioned medical, health, like anything that could be related to what was happening to the health infrastructure. So in this case, for each different hospital, we will then filter for the messages. So on your left, you can see we created this platform as a research platform for ourselves in order to bring together all of this information that we were having from different sources. So basically, for any hospital, one can have the filtering of any different ways that hospital will be named in Arabic. And then one can filter for that hospital and see all of the reports mentioning that hospital. We also have a translate button, because myself, I don't speak Arabic, my colleague Noor does, but yeah, doing this research without knowing the language can be done, but it's helpful to be able to translate it. So then for each hospital, we started like manually creating the events. So any events concerning attacks on fuel or on energy sources, attacks on the surroundings, direct strikes. We started manually doing this work, but we were finding that there was so much information coming in that still like doing this work manually was taking too long. And in that case, then what we did was we reconstructed the events into hospitals. We took the Shifa Hospital and the Indonesia Hospital, we did the 3D model. And as I was showing you earlier, we did the photo matching of images and videos coming out from the people who were taking shelter in those hospitals. And that allowed us, in both cases, we saw a similar pattern, where there was initially an attack on the surroundings of the hospital. Then there was a direct targeting, a siege and an invasion. So then understanding that we saw this from these two particular cases, we were seeing a pattern. Then we started tracing those words in the reports. So when are we hearing about attacks on surrounding streets? When are we hearing about direct targeting? Is there mentions of siege? Is there mentions of invasion? So what we did then was create this matrix here with all of the hospitals here. And I mean, it's a bit small for you to see, I think. But so for each different term, we were trying to see how many times that term appeared for each particular hospital. So in all of the different ways that attacks on surrounding can be found. So for example, attacks on the fuel generators, attacks on solar panels, attacks on surrounding streets, then we will look for any mentions of that. Similarly to direct targeting, so we see like fire in a building after bombing. So we could see the synonyms of those words, and then we basically plotted them over time, and we started to see that there was actually like a repetition of certain events around certain periods, and that helped us to go through that amount of information faster and understand this pattern. And it was then that we made this first publication at the end of December that was looking at which hospitals were undergoing this pattern. And at the time, 28 hospitals in 19th of December out of the 36 in Gaza had already been out of service. And when the invasion would move towards south after 1st of December and later down the line, we saw how this same pattern was operating in south of the strip. Well, I can introduce it as I try to load it. But the second pattern identification is investigating. I wanted to show you directly the platform, but I can also like run it from the presentation. Is looking at the at Israel's military use of humanitarian principles to forcefully displace Palestinian population. So we documented, 1 second, sorry. Okay. Yeah, so we documented 3 overlapping phases of this displacement plan. The first one was, as I was telling you, on October 13th, the order for 1.1 million people to displace from North Wadi Gaza, which is the river that crosses the Gaza Strip from north to south. And the second one started in December 1st, was the division of Gaza into 623 blocks that would receive evacuation orders. And the last one was the directing of the population towards safe areas that I will show you now, and then this third phase was when people were told to evacuate those safe areas. So across all 3 phases, what we have seen is that evacuation orders, like safe routes, safe zones, have failed to comply with humanitarian law. And we have seen how people have been sent from areas that had already had its infrastructure destroyed. And once they arrived to those areas, they were sometimes made to go and evacuate to yet another area. So I can show you, now this is loading, finally. So yeah, we conducted analysis with open source data, so scraping media, as I was telling you earlier, so taking media from like Telegram, also press releases, the statements by officials of the army, with anything that was concerning evacuation orders, known shelters, evacuation routes, and then we examined also the means for distributing such information. So how did that information actually reach the population? And this had 2 outputs. So one was 80-page report, which is maybe like an output for more of expert audience, and then an interactive output, which is this platform here that one can look into these like 3 different phases and then understand how each of them So in the report, we come up with this term, cartographic terror, which refers to the warnings, the evacuation orders, the safe zones, the safe corridors that were employed to create confusion and provide panic with unclear, incorrect, inconsistent, and conflicting instructions. So, for example, we would see that even though there was this area, I think, sorry, because I'm not seeing very well. For example, people would receive an evacuation order that was outlining an area that actually doesn't correspond with the grid that had been given previously. So that creates a lot of confusion. If you're in one of these blocks, you don't know exactly. If you're in one of the delimiting blocks, you don't know if your block should evacuate or it should not evacuate. So there's this kind of confusion created by conflicting media. Also, sometimes some of the evacuation orders would mention some blocks on the description, but then would outline different blocks on the evacuation order itself. These evacuation orders were sometimes disseminated through Facebook, and when people were asking, is my block supposed to evacuate or not, they never received any answer. Sometimes they were leaflets that were dropped over the population from airplanes. And it's actually what's interesting also about this grid is that this grid was presented as a humanitarian tool for evacuation, but this grid was actually part of a development plan that Israel did in the 1970s, a real state plan to develop within Gaza. And then on October, after the war began, and on October 7th, and there were the first bombings, the military used this grid to decide what were the areas to be bombed. So it was actually a military tool, first a real state tool, then a military tool, and finally it was repurposed as a humanitarian tool, right? So this is part of the question of, like how this grid, how this piece of media is changing its uses, and highlighting that is also maybe questioning what's actually the humanitarian purpose of such grid. Beyond the confusion, there's also the fact, as I was saying, that people were told to evacuate to an area, and then 1 or 2 days after were told to evacuate again. So the repeated evacuation is also creating like the impossibility to be sustaining life. And then, as I was saying, that like cartography as a form of as a tool of domination is at the beginning of the counter-forensic project. But when we speak about cartographic terror, we are referring to one aspect in this domination, which is the contradictory inconsistency of the tool of mapping and how this is being used. And for example, I think there's the example of the safe zone. So I don't know if this is, so these are the different safe zones, and these safe zones were given different delineations throughout time. So in one period, this layer is not loading now, sorry. But basically, the Mawasi safe zone, humanitarian zone, was given different demarcations throughout time. So I think actually it's on I can load the, here. Yeah, so for example here, I don't know where in the presentation it is because it's long, so I can show you here, no? 18th of October, 22nd of October, December 2nd, and 6th December, the humanitarian zone where people are supposed to be safe is given different delimitations. So then it gets very confusing for people to actually know where is the safe zone. And then, so after this investigation, we started working on the attacks on 8 and the targeting of 8. And I don't know, maybe if some of you are familiar with the context and remember that, so this is the platform that brings in all of the attacks. It's the first site is not very readable, I think. But maybe some of you remember that there was the flower massacre at the end of February, where a lot of people were going towards a truck that was delivering aid, and they were shot, and that created a stampede where a lot of people were killed. So after tracing that event, which happened here in the Nablusi roundabout, we started to see that there had been more events of civilians being killed around that same area. And that corresponded also with the new border, the Netzarim corridor, which was established by Israel within Gaza after, like, in mid-November. So once we started seeing that there was this targeting of civilians seeking aid, we started to look back in time, because when we situated all of these attacks in space and in time, we could see on this, on the timeline, there's like a concentration of the attacks on civilians seeking aid around this region. So we started to trace what were the logistical chains and supply chains of aid distribution throughout time, to understand how aid has been targeted, or whether aid had been targeted beyond this point. So, for example, when we started tracing bakeries, we saw that in the beginning of the war, people were very dependent. Is this bakeries? No, sorry, this is markets. I can't see from here. Bakeries. Yeah. So in brown, you have attacks on bakeries, and those were very prominent, especially on the first few weeks of the war. People had no electricity; they could not cook home, so they became dependent on bakeries. And some of the work we were doing was basically like tracing in social media any mentions of attacks on bakeries. And then also, in this case, we were looking at evidence of queues in bakeries. And there's like around here in this timeline, that's kind of my Miro board where I work, and I like look at, I take the evidence, I put it there, and I create this timeline, and then I try to geolocate this evidence. So given the architectural references, find where that is happening, or sometimes that is already geolocated by the open source community on Twitter. But in quite a few cases, we also found that right after images of queues on those bakeries had gone viral in social media, those bakeries were targeted. So then the work following was kind of seeing what were the key infrastructures for aid distribution in certain times, and what was happening to those infrastructures. So as you see, there's the intensity of attacks on bakeries, if you look at the timeline in the beginning. And then there's an intensity of attacks on shelters, because as people were displaced from their homes and moved into shelters, shelters became like distribution points of aid and preparation of aid. So those became then the targets. But then when people found that shelters were no longer safe and started moving towards refugee tent camps, and they themselves would go to seek for aid, that's when we started seeing the attacks on civilians seeking aid. And then the attacks on aid personnel that have been happening across time throughout the whole year, and similarly attacks on aid infrastructure. So that's like warehouses where aid is being stored. So that's a bit how we've been trying to map the evolution of the supply chains of aid, and how these have been targeted. And finally, I'd like to show you the tool that we are going to be launching end of this week, or beginning of next week, which is the database of all of the investigations that we have been doing this last year. So in case someone's taking pictures, please don't take pictures of this yet, because it's not yet published. But this has also been the way that we have been doing our research, but we're now bringing it into public space. And sorry, because I struggle a bit to see from here. But what we found that is necessary is to put different layers and spatial layers of information in relation to each other, in order to understand what the events that were unfolding. So, for example, this is like an evolution of the invasion line since October 28, when the ground invasion started. And then, for example, when we were looking at the patterns of destruction of medical infrastructure, so this is hospitals, right? Yeah. So, for example, we would see what's the relation between hospitals that are going out of service and this invasion line, right? And for example, we see that the first hospitals to go out of service correspond with the hospitals that are in the area where the invasion is moving forward. So this layering of different spatial analysis allows us to take further conclusions on how some of these patterns are operating. Similarly, we have been looking like at the road damage, for example, what roads have been damaged and how that is like creating like a difficulty of mobility towards critical infrastructure such as hospitals, or sorry, it takes me. Like, I'm gonna move my computer briefly to. No, there, so I can. Or 1 second. I'm gonna. Sorry that I'm being a bit messy. Gonna move this briefly here into the destruction of built environment. We actually see that sometimes when one looks only at the destruction of built environment, you still see parts of Gaza that are not destroyed, but when you put that in relation to destruction of vegetation, you can then see the destruction all throughout the strip. So that's why we created this tool that allows us to put different spatial layers together and work with them. And it also has a database of all of the incidents that we have verified since October 7th that involve targeting of civilians, destruction of infrastructure. We did an analysis of the first 3 weeks bombing campaign where we have more of 1,000 incidents of bombing with civilians that have been killed. And yeah, so our idea is also to share this database with the world end of this week, beginning of next week, so that we can also allow people to do their own analysis. And further in the future, a lot of the work that we do is and have done in the past is creating open source tools that people can use for their own investigations and analysis. So for example, the tool that I was showing earlier of the messages and how we bring them together and then do like an analysis of the recurrence of certain words. So that's like a tool that Peter and I developed beginning of this year and that we are now working to see if we can make it open source. Of course, it takes time to make sure that we make like a strong tool that anyone can use, and with all the research we're doing, it always gets put as the last priority, but that is also part of the counter-forensic project is also to make these tools available for people to, for people, for communities, for the public, so they can also do their own research. And yeah, that's all. I think I extended enough. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julia. So we're going to go to a Q&A section. I will hand over to Darren to kick that off. Going to put you on the spot.
Of course, yeah, we've got 15 minutes or so for Q&A. So please raise your hand with your question. I'd like to start by asking just about what some of the common barriers are to the research. What does the research run up against in terms of barriers or resistance?
Yeah, of course. So specifically about the projects I've presented, there were moments of blackouts where there was no communication. So those were moments where we had to kind of like understand from the information that comes after how to locate that in time and understand when exactly it was happening. Also, testimony is still something very scarce right now. We have very few testimonies of people that have been living what's happening within Gaza and that come out. So for example, there's a film we published last week with Dr. Hassan Abu Sita, who was in the Al-Ahi hospital when the explosion happened, and it's like a reconstruction of his testimony to understand how doctors lived that explosion and what lived testimony of that explosion can tell us beyond what satellite imagery or open source media can tell us, because there is also a need to have those testimonies come up, and I think with time they will come, but it's difficult at the moment only relying on open source media. Yeah, I think that's very...
So it is working. That's great. I just wanted to ask briefly, the curatorial part of forensic architecture's practice is really well known and really important, but choosing to move into these web platforms is a very different way of presenting your work. And the art world has also changed in relation to presenting work around this conflict. And I was wondering if there was a connection between the decision to move into this kind of presentation, or whether that's just part of the pace of this conflict and just kind of, the relation between how you choose to present, where you choose to present, and who to.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think also the pace of this last year has required us to work in a medium that was that could be like shared quickly and that we could kind of edit and react to in a fast pace. But right now we're working more on the curatorial side of this research. There's an exhibition that just opened in Vienna. There's one opening in Doha next year. So there's different curatorial projects at the moment, but this last year that has been quite intense on the events. As the events are unfolding, we're not researching something as we have done other times that's maybe in the past or in the recent past, but we're talking about something that is unfolding. So this has required us to work more in this digital means, but the curatorial is also coming in the next few months.
Hands up.
Hello. First of all, thank you. It was just amazing and such important work. I just wanted to ask a sort of a question about, are you vulnerable to spoofing of information? Like, it feels to me, looking at this, that you take great care about the authenticity, the accuracy of what you're doing. But I can imagine that when you're interacting with very powerful government players, particularly those as well-resourced and very, very smart as the IDF, that you could be vulnerable to them planting information and undermining your credibility. And I just wondered whether that is something that you consider and whether you do anything about that.
Yeah, so we have like a quite rigorous verification process and fact-checking process that we follow for each piece of evidence. So in this database that has like around 4,000 pieces of evidence, we have like a whole process that we follow for each. We have to be able to like geolocate each piece of evidence, and if that's not possible to geolocate, it then has to be from like a credible source. So for example, UN or like a known and credible source, and then we have to be able to locate it with satellite. So we do have like a very strong verification process, especially because some of the work that we've used in this last year was referenced, for example, for South African lawyers in the International Court of Justice. So we cannot risk any of that to be spoofed. And then, and then it's also like, when evidence is presented by any party, we have to analyze, is that piece of evidence, is that claim being made with that evidence something we can trust, or do we have to work to unmake that claim? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we do find, for example, I think especially there was this like images of bombing in Beirut these last few days that came out that were AI produced. In that case, for us, if we have an image of an explosion, then we have to be able to locate that in a video in time, to have sometimes different cameras that point to that piece of evidence. I think like it would be. It's still for us to find a piece, like we have found pieces of AI, of evidence that we have not been able to locate in space or in time or through satellite analysis, and we have discarded them. And I mean, these 4,000 events come from a database that had 12,000 events, but we really are like, we are only gonna take those pieces of evidence that we can like be 100% sure that can be used in any forum. So in an exhibition space, but also in a court.
Maybe this is a bit of a mad question, but I'll ask it anyway. You're involved in pattern analysis, and you're logging week by week, day by day, by hour, you're building up a really detailed and systematic picture of what's happening. Is there a kind of lurking idea that there is actually a predictive potential here as well? That the patterns that you're logging are things that, I mean, as you're working on this, do you have conversations saying, I bet the next thing is going to be X, and it happens? Is there an element of an application of prediction in the data that you're gathering?
Well, rather than in the data gathering, I think there's also it's a system of violence what's being put place in Gaza, and as a system of violence, you can see a repeated pattern. We can never predict, and we would never. We would never do like kind of a prediction analysis. That's not what forensic architecture does, because our work is of evidence production and construction. But for example, with the evacuation orders, as the invasion in Rafah happened, we saw a lot of things that we had seen in the north before, or with hospitals, we saw the same pattern of attacks on surroundings, striking of hospital, siege and the invasion. So we do see repeated patterns, but we don't work as a predictive agency or modeling, because also things change, international politics change, so we also have to take those things into account that are not only like the spatial analysis that we can carry out, but also the political context that we're moving in.
Hi, yeah, I just wondered what your relationship was with the mainstream media, whether they come to you for evidence, whether they ignore your evidence, what, is it an uneasy relationship? I just wondered how that plays out.
Yeah, I think, so mainstream media has at times collaborated with us for the output of some investigations, where we will publish in that media, like New York Times or The Guardian, the outputs of our investigations. And even like now, New York Times or Washington Post, they have their own like visual forensics units. And like when the New York Times unit was being set up, it was trained by forensic architecture. So there is a relationship. But we also don't work in the same pace as they do, as I was saying earlier. So we also have kind of the privilege of being able to work in longer time and not being like subsumed by the pace of news cycles. But we do collaborate with them, and more like we're becoming more specialists, maybe, that we are consulted about something. But now that's also changing, as the main like media outlets are creating their own like visual forensics units, and they have their own means to carry similar analysis.
This might be a bit of a follow-on question. You've inferred causality, I think, in some of the things you've presented, and I do think the other question you had there about the predictive nature, I just think it's something interesting to think about in terms of being able to verify your assumptions about causality if you are able to predict, maybe not for public consumption, but as a way of testing your models. I just think that's an interesting area to think about.
Yeah, I think because there's different ways of understanding prediction, right? Are we talking about a form of like automated prediction? And I don't think we are there yet, or that's like the tool that we would use. We do have like intuitive prediction, as in the sense that sometimes when you're looking at a satellite imagery, you see the movement of the Earth in a way that you know that the military have been there. So there's like a way of intuition more than prediction yet, in the way that we're going about our analysis. Yeah, I mean, we have used like more like image recognition and AI in the past in some of the projects that we've worked with, but not specifically on this one.
Thank you. I was thinking when you were talking about the different specialist layers of information that you can apply, would you ever apply different forms of violence, such as like Hamas attacks as well, so you can compare the different violence trends, and again, so to try and keep a more non-biased approach?
Yes, so what we're looking at is how a state and a military army is invading a land, and how a population is being, we're looking at state actors. What forensic architecture does is analyze the violence of state actors. So that's why we focus on state actors and not on non-state actors like Hamas.
So slightly different tack. What's really interesting from how you're talking about what's been revealed here, and you're coming up with new language, maybe not new, but certainly new to me, about language for the actions and language for the impacts. And I wondered if there is new language that you've come across as you develop a notion of what these patterns are, of the sequence of things of either side, and then also what is adversarial design.
So yes, so for example, like cartographic terror is a term that we came up specifically for the investigation that we were doing, because we were seeing how cartography and maps were being used in order to terrorize a population, right? With that misinformation and like miscommunication. And we have a glossary in our website with the terms that we have been developing in these last years. And also, we understand that maybe there's no term that can serve globally, but there are terms that are also situated in a specific form of violence, right? And then secondly, about adversarial design. So it's kind of what we're proposing here. We're taking the maps and the evacuation orders that were handed out by the IDF, but we're then situating those in space and seeing exactly what they mean. So we would see that example I was showing earlier of the round circle that is making impossible for certain blocks to know whether they have to evacuate or not. So that's the adversarial design. It's taking a form of design that has been made and situating it in another plane so you can make a counterclaim maybe to that form of design.
Okay, Julia, I think we might have to end it there. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. I do really want to make time for the screenings that we have. But yeah, thank you. That was a brilliant talk and a real pleasure to have you. So as I mentioned before, we have 3 video works screening. We have the Ecocide in Gaza film playing behind my left side of the audience here. And we have the film about the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh in this corridor here, leading into the larger theatre space where we're showing a work about the German genocide in Namibia, which is a more historical event.
That was beautiful.